Behind the golden gates of Thornbury Palace, where tradition and protocol reign supreme, some doors are meant to remain forever closed. The late Queen Isabella's private chambers have stood untouched for 3 years, sealed by royal decree and guarded by both duty and grief. But when palace security cameras capture an unexpected breach in the dead of night, Crown Prince Edward must confront a truth that could shatter the very foundation of the monarchy he's sworn to protect. What secrets lie hidden in those forbidden rooms, and how far will those closest to the throne go to keep them buried? First story, the autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Thornbury Palace as Crown Prince Edward Alexander Worthington stood in his private study, reviewing the morning state papers. At 38, he carried the weight of future kingship with the same measured dignity that had defined the Worthington dynasty for over 4 centuries. His dark hair, touched with premature silver at the temples, caught the lamplight as he bent over documents requiring his attention. The palace moved around him with its usual clockwork precision. Servants glided through marble corridors with practiced silence, their footsteps muffled by ancient Persian rugs. The smell of beeswax and fresh flowers permeated the air, a constant reminder of the endless maintenance required to keep such a vast estate functioning. Outside, the gardens stretched toward the horizon, meticulously maintained even as the season turned the leaves to gold and crimson. Edward's morning routine had remained unchanged for years. He rose at 6, exercised in the private gymnasium, breakfasted alone while reading international news, and then settled into his study for the day's official duties. This consistency provided an anchor in a life that often felt like it belonged more to the nation than to himself. The crown demanded sacrifice, and Edward had learned early that personal desires came secondary to duty. His marriage to Duchess Camilla Blackwood had been arranged 5 years earlier, a union that satisfied both political necessity and public expectation. With Trust Teddy, Camilla brought with her an impeccable bloodline, extensive charitable connections, and the kind of polished elegance that photographed well for the society pages. She understood the role expected of a future queen consort and performed it flawlessly. Yet Edward sometimes wondered if either of them had ever truly known the other beyond their official capacities. The palace staff respected both of them, but there was something different in how they spoke of Edward compared to his wife. With the prince, there was genuine warmth mixed with reverence. The older servants remembered him as a serious child who always thanked them politely and never demanded special treatment. He had grown into a man who knew the names of every groundskeeper's children and who quietly arranged for improved housing for retired palace employees. Camilla, by contrast, was appreciated for her efficiency and professionalism. She never created unnecessary work, always dressed appropriately, and maintained perfect protocol. But there was a distance there, an invisible barrier that even years of shared residence hadn't bridged. The staff performed their duties for her with precision, but without the subtle warmth they showed toward Edward. The morning had proceeded normally until Charles Pemberton, the head of palace security, requested an urgent private audience. Pemberton was a former military officer whose discretion and loyalty had earned Edward's complete trust over the past decade. When he appeared at the study door with an expression of barely controlled concern, Edward knew something significant had occurred. "Your Royal Highness," Pemberton began, his voice carefully controlled, "we need to discuss a security matter that requires your immediate attention." Edward gestured toward the leather chairs arranged near the fireplace away from his desk where sensitive documents lay scattered. The security chief's posture remained rigid even as he took the offered seat, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. "What kind of security matter?" Edward asked, settling into the opposite chair. Years of dealing with everything from terrorist threats to overzealous photographers had taught him to remain calm until he understood the full scope of any situation. Pemberton reached into his jacket and withdrew a small tablet device. His fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency before he turned it toward Edward. "The night security cameras captured something unusual, sir." "In the East Wing!" Edward's chest tightened. The East Wing housed his late mother's private quarters, rooms that had remained sealed since Queen Isabella's death 3 years earlier. By royal protocol and Edward's explicit command, no one was permitted entry except for minimal maintenance performed under strict supervision twice yearly. The tablet screen showed a corridor Edward recognized immediately. The ornate wallpaper and crystal sconces were intimately familiar, part of a wing where he had spent countless childhood hours. The timestamp indicated the recording was from 2 nights ago at approximately 11:30 in the evening. As the footage played, a figure appeared in the frame. Even in the black and white recording, Edward immediately recognized his wife's distinctive silhouette. Camilla moved purposefully down the corridor, clearly familiar with her destination. She paused at a specific door, withdrew what appeared to be a key from her pocket, and disappeared inside. Edward's hand unconsciously gripped the arm of his chair. Those were his mother's private chambers, the most personal space the late Queen had maintained. Not her official receiving rooms or state apartments, but the intimate suite where she had retreated from the demands of public life, where she had kept her private correspondence, personal mementos, and the parts of herself that existed beyond the crown. "How long was she inside?" Edward asked quietly, his voice betraying none of the turmoil building within him. 47 minutes, sir." Pemberton's response was immediate and precise. She emerged with what appeared to be several items, though the camera angle doesn't allow us to see exactly what. The security chief advanced the footage to show Camilla's exit. She carried a small bag that hadn't been visible when she entered, and her movements seemed more hurried than before. She paused to lock the door behind her, before disappearing from the camera's range. Edward studied the timestamp again. 2 nights ago, he had retired early with a headache, leaving Camilla to attend a charity gala reception in the palace's staterooms. The event had concluded around 10:30, which would have given her ample time to change and make her way to the East Wing without drawing attention. "Have you reviewed the key logs?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Yes, sir. No official key was signed out for those chambers." The Duchess must have obtained access through other means. Other means. Edward's mind raced through the possibilities. His mother had kept several keys to her private rooms, distributing them only to her most trusted personal staff. Upon her death, those keys should have been returned to the royal household's master key registry. But Edward realized now that he had never personally verified this process, trusting others to handle such details during his period of grief. The implications were staggering. Not only had Camilla gained unauthorized access to sacred private space, but she had done so deliberately and secretively. This wasn't a case of mistaken protocol or innocent curiosity. The careful timing, the concealment, the removal of items all pointed to premeditation. "Who else knows about this?" Edward asked. "Only myself and the night security officer who first noticed the anomaly during routine review. I've instructed him to maintain absolute discretion, pending your directions." Edward nodded, grateful for Pemberton's foresight. Palace gossip could spread like wildfire, and news of this incident reaching the wrong ears could create complications he wasn't prepared to handle. "I want a complete review of all security footage from the East Wing for the past 6 months, he instructed. "Discreet inquiries into who might have had access to keys for those chambers. And I want a detailed inventory of the room's contents compared against the last official catalog." "Already in progress, sir," Pemberton replied. Though the inventory may take some time, the late Queen's personal effects were extensively cataloged, but much of the documentation is stored in the royal archives. After the security chief departed, Edward remained alone in his study, staring at the cold fireplace. The autumn rain had intensified, creating a steady rhythm against the windows that matched the turbulent beating of his heart. For 3 years he had preserved his mother's private spaces exactly as she had left them, not out of morbid attachment, but out of respect for her memory and the understanding that some sanctuaries should remain inviolate. She had been his anchor, his moral compass, and his most trusted advisor. Their relationship had transcended the formal bounds of royal protocol, built on genuine affection and mutual respect. Her sudden death from a heart attack had left a void in Edward's life that official duties and public obligations could never fill. Now, to discover that someone he trusted, someone who should have shared his reverence for his mother's memory, had violated that sacred space felt like a personal betrayal beyond anything he could have imagined. The questions multiplied in his mind like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. What could Camilla have been seeking in those rooms? What had she taken? How long had she been planning this? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what else might she have done that he remained unaware of? The afternoon stretched before him filled with scheduled appointments and official obligations, but Edward found his concentration scattered. During a meeting with agricultural ministers, his mind wandered to memories of his mother's private sitting room, with its comfortable chairs and walls lined with personal photographs. While reviewing trade agreements, he found himself remembering the small writing desk where his mother had penned personal letters, maintaining correspondence with friends and family that existed entirely separate from her official duties. As evening approached, Edward realized he would have to confront Camilla directly. The alternative was to live with the knowledge of her transgression while pretending normalcy, and he discovered he lacked the capacity for such deception. Their marriage might be built on mutual duty rather than passionate love, but it had been founded on trust and respect. If that foundation had been compromised, he needed to understand the full extent of the damage. The challenge would be approaching the conversation in a way that allowed for explanation without immediately destroying everything they had built together. Perhaps there was a reasonable explanation, some circumstance that would make her actions understandable if not forgivable. Edward found himself hoping for such an explanation, even as his rational mind struggled to imagine what it might be. The great clock in the palace tower chimed 8 times as Edward made his way through corridors that suddenly felt less like home and more like a stage where everyone performed roles they had never chosen for themselves. The weight of the coming confrontation settled on his shoulders like a mantle of lead, but he walked forward anyway. Some conversations, no matter how difficult, could not be postponed. Tomorrow would bring whatever consequences emerged from tonight's revelations. But first, he needed to understand what his wife had been seeking in the forbidden chambers of the dead. Second story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the breakfast room as Edward entered to find Camilla already seated at the mahogany table, delicately spreading marmalade on her toast. Her auburn hair was perfectly arranged despite the early hour, and she wore a navy blue dress that complemented her pale complexion. To any observer, she appeared the picture of composed elegance, but Edward noticed the slight tension around her eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. "Good morning, darling," she said without looking up from her plate. Her voice carried its usual melodious quality, refined by years of elocution training and social refinement. "I trust you slept well." Edward took his customary seat across from her, accepting coffee from the attending footman with a brief nod. The formal dining setting, with its crystal glasses and silver service, suddenly felt more like a barrier than a shared space. "Well enough," he replied, though in truth he had spent most of the night replaying the security footage in his mind. The breakfast proceeded with their usual exchange of pleasantries and schedule coordination. Camilla mentioned her afternoon appointment with the curator of the National Portrait Gallery, discussing plans for a charity exhibition. Edward shared details about his upcoming visit to a veterans rehabilitation center. On the surface, everything appeared normal, but Edward found himself studying his wife's expressions for any sign of guilt or unease. 3 days had passed since his meeting with Pemberton, and Edward had spent that time gathering additional information. The inventory comparison had revealed several missing items from his mother's private chambers, including a wooden jewelry box that had belonged to Queen Isabella's grandmother, several leather-bound personal journals, and a collection of letters tied with blue ribbon. The loss of these intimate possessions felt like another violation, deepening Edward's sense of betrayal. More disturbing still was the security review, which had uncovered 2 additional unauthorized visits over the past 4 months. Camilla's midnight intrusions had apparently been part of a pattern rather than a single impulsive act. The systematic nature of her behavior suggested planning and purpose that made Edward's stomach clench with apprehension. "I've been thinking about Mother's anniversary," Edward said carefully, watching Camilla's reaction. Queen Isabella's death anniversary was approaching in 6 weeks, and the royal family traditionally marked the occasion with a private memorial service. Perhaps we should arrange for Father Benedict to say a special mass in the palace chapel. Camilla's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and Edward caught a flicker of something, perhaps nervousness, across her features. "Of course," she replied after a moment. "That would be entirely appropriate. Shall I coordinate with the chapel staff?" "I thought I might handle the arrangements myself this year," Edward said, maintaining casual tone while studying her response. "I'd like to spend some time in Mother's private quarters, perhaps selecting some personal items to display during the service." This time, Camilla's reaction was unmistakable. Her hand trembled slightly as she set down her cup, and color drained from her cheeks before she quickly composed herself. "I'm sure that would be meaningful," she managed, though her voice had lost some of its earlier steadiness. The remainder of breakfast passed in stilted conversation, with both of them clearly aware that something had shifted in the atmosphere. When Camilla excused herself to prepare for her morning appointments, Edward remained at the table, contemplating his next move. Later that afternoon, Edward made his way to the East Wing, accompanied by Pemberton and carrying the master key to his mother's private chambers. The corridor felt different now, tainted by the knowledge of Camilla's secret visits. As they approached the ornate door with its familiar brass nameplate reading, "Her late Majesty's private apartments," Edward's chest tightened with a mixture of grief and anger. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door swung open to reveal the sitting room exactly as his mother had left it. The familiar scent of lavender sachets and lemon oil polish enveloped him, triggering a wave of memories so intense he had to steady himself against the doorframe. Queen Isabella's presence seemed to linger in every carefully arranged detail, from the chintz-covered armchairs to the silver-framed photographs clustered on the side tables. But as Edward moved through the rooms, guided by Pemberton's detailed inventory notes, the evidence of intrusion became apparent. Books had been moved on the shelves, drawers showed signs of careful searching, and several personal items were conspicuously absent. The violation felt profound, as if someone had ransacked a sacred shrine. In his mother's private study, Edward discovered the most disturbing evidence yet. The antique writing desk where Queen Isabella had composed her personal correspondence had been thoroughly searched. The secret compartment that Edward remembered from childhood visits had been opened, its contents removed. That hidden space had contained his mother's most private papers, documents she had never intended for public consumption. "The missing journals and letters," Pemberton said quietly, consulting his notes. "They were likely stored in that compartment. Your mother was known to be meticulous about preserving family correspondence and personal reflections." Edward sank into his mother's desk chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Camilla's betrayal. These weren't random thefts or casual curiosity. She had systematically targeted the most personal and potentially sensitive materials in the entire suite. But why? What could she possibly hope to gain from his mother's private writings? As if summoned by his thoughts, the soft sound of footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. Edward and Pemberton exchanged glances before moving to the sitting room window that provided a clear view of the East Wing entrance. Camilla stood at the corridor's end, clearly having followed them there. Her usual composure had cracked, replaced by an expression of barely controlled panic. "She knows we've discovered her," Pemberton observed quietly. Edward watched his wife pace in the corridor, apparently debating whether to approach or retreat. The sight of her obvious distress stirred conflicting emotions within him. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the violations, some part of him still hoped for an explanation that would restore the trust they had shared. "Give us the room," Edward instructed Pemberton. "I need to speak with my wife privately." The security chief nodded and made his way toward the corridor, passing Camilla with a respectful but clearly disapproving nod. After a moment's hesitation, she entered the sitting room where Edward waited among his mother's preserved belongings. "You..." she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you've been here. Edward replied, standing behind his mother's favorite armchair like a shield. Multiple times, in fact, taking things that don't belong to you, violating spaces that should have remained sacred. Camilla's composed facade finally crumbled, tears spilling down her cheeks as she collapsed into the chair opposite him. "You don't understand," she began, her voice breaking. "You couldn't possibly understand." "Then explain it to me," Edward said, fighting to keep his own emotions in check. "Explain how the woman I married, the woman I trusted with the future of this monarchy, could do something so fundamentally dishonest." For several minutes, only the sound of Camilla's quiet sobbing filled the room. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes held a desperation he had never seen before. "Your mother knew," she whispered. "Knew what? About my past. About things I did before we married. Things that could destroy everything if they ever became public." Edward's mind reeled. "What kind of things?" Camilla's hands twisted in her lap as she struggled to find words. "There was someone before you, someone I loved deeply, passionately. We were engaged, planning to marry, but he was married to someone else, and when his wife discovered our affair, she threatened to expose everything." The confession hit Edward like a physical blow. Their marriage had been arranged, but he had always believed Camilla came to it with the same clean slate he offered. The knowledge that she had hidden such a significant relationship, one that apparently involved adultery, shattered his understanding of who she really was. "The letters your mother kept," Camilla continued, her voice growing stronger with the relief of finally speaking the truth. "Some of them were from that time period, from mutual friends, family members who knew about the situation. Your mother had been investigating my background before approving our engagement, and she had documented everything." Edward felt the room spinning around him. His mother had known about Camilla's past and approved the marriage anyway? Or had she been planning to expose the truth at some point? The implications were staggering. "So you stole her private papers to protect yourself?" he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "To protect us," Camilla corrected desperately. "To protect the monarchy. If those documents ever became public, the scandal would be enormous. Your mother was apparently planning to confront me about it, but she died before we could have that conversation." The weight of revelation settled over Edward like a suffocating blanket. His wife had systematically violated his mother's privacy, stolen irreplaceable family documents, and built their entire marriage on a foundation of lies and omissions. Yet she claimed to have done it all for the greater good, to protect the institution they both served. "Where are the documents now?" he asked quietly. "Safe," Camilla replied. "Hidden where no one will ever find them. I want them back. All of them. Every journal, every letter, every photograph you removed from these rooms." Camilla's face went pale again. "Edward, if you read them, if you see what your mother wrote about me, about us, it will change everything between us." "Everything already has changed," Edward said, moving toward the window where afternoon light filtered through his mother's lace curtains. "The question now is whether we can find a way to rebuild from the truth, or whether this marriage was doomed from the moment you decided to lie to me." The silence that followed felt eternal, heavy with the weight of broken trust and uncertain futures. Outside, the palace gardens continued their autumn transformation, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within the ancient walls. But inside Queen Isabella's private chambers, two people who had thought they understood their roles in life found themselves facing the possibility that everything they had built together might crumble into dust. Third story. The clock tower chimed midnight as Edward sat alone in his private study, surrounded by the recovered documents spread across his leather desk like pieces of a shattered puzzle. Camilla had finally surrendered the stolen items that evening, her hands shaking as she placed the familiar wooden box containing his mother's most private possessions on the table between them. The weight of Queen Isabella's secrets now pressed down upon him with an intensity that made sleep impossible. The leather-bound journals lay open, revealing his mother's precise handwriting in black ink. Her words painted a picture of a woman far more complex than the composed sovereign the world had known. These pages contained her doubts, her fears, her private struggles with the enormous responsibility of the crown. But more disturbing were her detailed observations about Camilla, notes that revealed a thorough investigation into his future wife's background. Edward's hands trembled slightly as he read his mother's account of discovering Camilla's affair with Lord James Pemberton, the eldest son of the Duke of Wessex. The irony wasn't lost on him that Charles Pemberton, his trusted security chief, was the younger brother of Camilla's former lover. Queen Isabella had documented the entire sordid tale with meticulous attention to detail, including dates, locations, and corroborating witnesses. The affair had lasted 2 years while Lord James was married to Lady Sarah Pemberton. According to his mother's notes, Camilla had genuinely believed James would divorce his wife to marry her. When Lady Sarah discovered the relationship and threatened a scandalous public divorce that would have destroyed both families' reputations, James had chosen his marriage over his mistress. But the most shocking revelation wasn't the affair itself, but what Queen Isabella had discovered about its aftermath. Camilla hadn't simply accepted rejection and moved on. In her desperation and humiliation, she had attempted to blackmail James with intimate letters and photographs, threatening to expose their relationship if he didn't leave his wife. Only the intervention of both families' lawyers and a substantial financial settlement had prevented a public catastrophe. Edward pushed back from his desk, overwhelmed by the magnitude of deception. The woman he had married wasn't merely someone with a romantic past, but someone capable of extortion and manipulation when cornered. His mother's final entry about Camilla, dated just 2 weeks before her death, contained a chilling assessment. She is beautiful, intelligent, and utterly ruthless in pursuit of her goals. She will make Edward a suitable wife if properly managed, but he must never trust her completely. The sound of soft footsteps in the corridor outside drew Edward's attention. Through the gap beneath his study door, he could see the shadow of someone pacing in the hallway. Camilla had been unable to sleep since their confrontation, and her restless wandering through the palace had become a nightly occurrence. Part of him wondered if she was planning another theft, perhaps seeking additional evidence that might further protect her secrets. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Edward, may I come in?" He gathered the scattered documents into a neat pile before responding. "Enter." Camilla appeared in the doorway wearing a silk dressing gown, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. Without makeup and formal attire, she looked younger and more vulnerable, but Edward found he could no longer trust even her apparent fragility. Too much of what he had believed about her had proven false. "I saw the light under your door," she said quietly, remaining near the entrance as if afraid to approach too closely. "I couldn't sleep either." "I imagine not." Edward's voice carried a coldness that made her flinch. Conscience tends to be a demanding companion once awakened. She moved hesitantly toward the chairs arranged before the fireplace, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. "Have you read everything?" "Enough." Edward remained behind his desk, using the furniture as a barrier between them. "Enough to understand that our entire marriage has been built on lies. Enough to realize that you're not the woman I thought I was marrying." Camilla sank into one of the chairs, her composure cracking again. "The affair with James was real," she admitted. "I loved him desperately, foolishly. But everything else, the blackmail attempt, the settlement money, it was all my family's idea. They were terrified of the scandal, of losing their position in society. I was young and heartbroken, and I let them convince me it was the only way." "My mother's notes suggest otherwise," Edward replied, selecting one of the journals. "She spoke to several witnesses who described your behavior during that period. The threats, the demands, the manipulation, they all came from you directly." Tears streamed down Camilla's face as the last of her defensive walls crumbled. "I was desperate," she whispered. "I had given James everything, sacrificed my reputation, my future, for what I thought was love. When he chose his wife over me, I felt like my life was over. With trust, Teddy. I wanted him to hurt the way I was hurting, Edward studied his wife's anguished expression, searching for any sign of the calculating woman his mother had described. What he saw instead was someone who had made terrible choices in youth and spent years running from the consequences. But recognition of her pain didn't diminish the magnitude of her deceptions. "The financial settlement?" he said. "How much?" £50,000. Camilla's voice was barely audible, enough to ensure my family's silence and my cooperation in disappearing from James's life completely. The sum was substantial but not enormous by aristocratic standards. Still, it represented a transaction that reduced their relationship to a business arrangement, a detail that somehow made everything worse. Edward tried to imagine the young woman Camilla had been, desperate enough to accept money in exchange for her silence, and found the image profoundly disturbing. Where is the money now? Gone. My family used it to pay debts and improve our estate. They made sure I understood that I owed them everything, that without their intervention I would have been completely ruined. Camilla looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. Meeting you, marrying you, was supposed to be my chance at redemption, a way to become someone worthy of respect again. Edward closed the journal and moved to the window overlooking the gardens. Dawn was still hours away, but the security lights illuminated the carefully manicured landscape that stretched toward the distant tree line. Everything in his world was ordered, controlled, maintained, to appear perfect for public consumption. But underneath that polished surface, chaos and deception flourished like weeds. "My mother knew all of this before she approved our engagement," he said without turning around. "Steady. She documented every detail but never shared her concerns with me directly. I have to assume she intended to address it eventually, perhaps after we were married and the initial public excitement had settled. She was protecting you," Camilla said quietly, "and protecting the monarchy. Your mother understood that personal happiness was secondary to duty. She probably believed that my past mistakes wouldn't matter as long as I performed my role correctly." The practical ruthlessness of his mother's approach shouldn't have surprised Edward, but it did. Queen Isabella had always been a master of long-term strategy, capable of accepting short-term complications in service of larger goals. But the idea that she had knowingly allowed him to marry someone she considered potentially dangerous felt like a betrayal of their close relationship.
"What about Charles Pemberton?" Edward asked suddenly.
"Does he know about your relationship with his brother?" Camilla's sharp intake of breath provided the answer before she spoke. "James told him everything when the scandal broke. Charles was furious, not just about the affair, but about the attempted blackmail. He warned James that I was dangerous, that I would destroy anyone who got in my way." The revelation hit Edward like a physical blow. His trusted security chief, the man who had served him loyally for a decade, had been monitoring his wife all along. Charles's discovery of Camilla's midnight raids hadn't been accidental surveillance, but deliberate observation born from years of suspicion and distrust. "He's been watching you," Edward said, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "All this time, Charles has been waiting for you to reveal your true nature." "I know." Camilla's voice carried a resignation that spoke of years living under scrutiny. "I felt his disapproval from the moment I arrived at the palace. Every interaction, every conversation, I could sense his judgment. But I hoped that by being perfect, by never putting a foot wrong, I could earn his trust eventually." Edward turned back to face his wife, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. The poised, elegant woman who had charmed the press and public was indeed a performance, but not the kind of calculated deception he had imagined. Instead, she was someone desperately trying to become worthy of the role she had been given, haunted by mistakes that had shaped her entire adult life. "The stolen documents," he said. "You took them because you were afraid my mother had left instructions for me to discover your past after her death." "I was terrified," Camilla admitted. "You wished me anyway. Your mother had been so kind to me, so welcoming, but I always sensed she was evaluating me. When she died suddenly, I panicked. I thought if there were any records of her investigation, any evidence of what she knew, I needed to find it before you did. The morning light was beginning to filter through the heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the study. Edward realized they had spent the entire night in this strange confession, stripping away years of careful pretense to reveal the damaged foundation beneath their marriage. "What happens now?" Camilla asked, her voice small and uncertain. Edward considered the question that would determine not only their personal future but potentially the stability of the monarchy itself. A divorce would create exactly the kind of scandal Camilla had spent years trying to avoid. But continuing their marriage with this knowledge between them seemed equally impossible. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I need time to think, to understand what this means for both of us." Camilla nodded, rising from her chair with the careful movements of someone carrying a tremendous weight. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back at him. "For what it's worth, Edward, everything I've felt for you has been real. Whatever I was before, whatever mistakes I made, my respect and affection for you has been genuine." After she left, Edward remained alone in his study as the palace awakened around him. Servants began their morning routines, gardeners emerged to tend the grounds, and the machinery of royal life resumed its relentless rhythm. But for the first time in his adult life, Edward wasn't certain what role he was supposed to play in the elaborate performance that was his existence. The stolen documents lay before him like evidence in a trial where he served as both judge and defendant. His mother's final assessment echoed in his mind: beautiful, intelligent, and utterly ruthless in pursuit of her goals. The question that remained was whether Camilla's ultimate goal was worthy of the deception required to achieve it, and whether he possessed the wisdom to make that determination. Fourth story, the emergency meeting of the Privy Council convened at dawn in the palace's most secure conference room, its oak-paneled walls having witnessed centuries of royal crises and constitutional deliberations. Edward sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, flanked by his most trusted advisors, their faces grave with the understanding that the monarchy itself might be at a crossroads. The stolen documents lay sealed in a leather portfolio before him, their contents capable of destroying everything the royal family had spent generations building. Lord Chancellor Harrison, a distinguished man in his 60s whose family had served the crown for 4 generations, cleared his throat before speaking. "Your Royal Highness, given the sensitive nature of what you've shared, we must consider all possible outcomes and their implications for the stability of the realm." Archbishop Williams, representing the Church's perspective on royal marriage, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The tall, silver-haired cleric had officiated at Edward and Camilla's wedding 5 years earlier, and the revelation of her past clearly troubled him deeply. "The moral implications alone are staggering," he said quietly. The future queen consort engaged in adultery and attempted extortion. The public reaction would be catastrophic. Edward studied the faces around the table, men and women who had dedicated their lives to preserving the institution of monarchy. Each carried the weight of history on their shoulders, understanding that their decisions in this room would echo through future generations. The burden of leadership had never felt heavier than it did in this moment. "What are our legal options?" Edward asked, though he dreaded the answer. Sir Margaret Chen, the royal family's chief legal counsel, consulted her notes before responding. Her reputation for meticulous analysis and discretion had earned her Edward's complete trust over the past 8 years. Divorce proceedings would require either mutual consent or proof of irreconcilable differences. Given the circumstances, proving grounds would not be difficult. However, the public scrutiny and media attention would be unprecedented. The thought of their private agonies becoming tabloid fodder made Edward's stomach clench. The British press had elevated royal watching to an art form, and a divorce involving accusations of adultery and blackmail would dominate headlines for months or years. "What about annulment?" suggested Lord Pemberton, Charles's older brother and a member of the House of Lords. His presence at this meeting felt surreal given his family's connection to the scandal, but his legal expertise was invaluable. If the marriage was entered into under false pretenses, if material facts were concealed, Archbishop Williams shook his head. Annulment would require proving the marriage was never valid. While deception was involved, both parties were free to marry and did so with proper consent. The church would have difficulty supporting such a claim. Edward listened to the debate swirling around him, legal and political experts dissecting his personal life with clinical precision. But beneath their professional analysis, he sensed genuine concern for both his well-being and the future of the monarchy. These weren't merely advisors protecting an institution. They were people who cared about him personally. "There is another consideration," Lord Chancellor Harrison said carefully. "The timing of this revelation, coming from documents stolen from the late Queen's private chambers, raises questions about how the information was obtained. Any public disclosure would necessarily involve explaining that breach of security." The irony wasn't lost on Edward. Camilla's crime in stealing his mother's papers had actually created a barrier to exposing her original sins. Revealing her past would require acknowledging her theft, which would create additional scandal and raise uncomfortable questions about palace security. "What does the security investigation reveal about potential accomplices?" Sir Margaret asked. Edward glanced toward the door, knowing that Charles Pemberton waited outside, ready to brief the council on his findings. The security chief's knowledge of Camilla's past had clearly influenced his vigilant surveillance, but his professionalism had never wavered in his service to the crown. "Charles believes she acted alone in accessing the chambers," Edward replied. "But his investigation has revealed that she had been researching the location and security of those rooms for months. This wasn't impulsive behavior, but careful planning." The systematic nature of Camilla's actions troubled the council members visibly. Spontaneous mistakes could be forgiven or overlooked, but calculated deception suggested a character flaw that might manifest again in the future. "We must consider the Duchess's motivations," Archbishop Williams said thoughtfully. "Was this purely self-preservation, or does it indicate a pattern of behavior that could pose ongoing risks?" Edward had wrestled with the same question through sleepless nights since the confrontation. Camilla's tearful confessions had seemed genuine, but her ability to maintain perfect composure for years while harboring such secrets suggested reserves of deception that made him question everything he thought he knew about her. "She claimed she was protecting the monarchy as much as herself," Edward said. "The argument being that scandal would damage the institution more than her personal concealment of the truth." Lord Chancellor Harrison leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "That reasoning could justify almost any deception. If we accept that premise, where does it end? What other secrets might she consider acceptable to hide for the greater good?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild completely. Even if Camilla never again engaged in theft or deception, the knowledge that she was capable of such actions would forever color Edward's perception of her behavior. "There's also the matter of precedent," Sir Margaret noted. "How we handle this situation will establish expectations for future royal marriages. If we overlook such serious breaches of trust, what message does that send about the standards we expect from members of the royal family?" The burden of setting precedent weighed heavily on Edward's shoulders. His decisions wouldn't only affect his personal happiness, but would influence how future generations navigated the complex intersection of private desires and public duty. A soft knock interrupted their deliberations. Charles Pemberton entered at Edward's invitation, his military bearing unchanged despite the personal connections to the scandal under discussion. His professionalism in navigating such conflicted loyalties had been exemplary. "Your Royal Highness, we've completed our security review," he reported. "The Duchess accessed the protected chambers on 3 occasions over 4 months. Each visit lasted between 45 minutes and an hour. She removed various documents and personal items systematically, suggesting she was following some kind of list or plan." "Any indication of what she was specifically seeking?" Lord Chancellor Harrison asked. "Based on what was taken versus what remained, she focused primarily on personal correspondence and private journals. Items that would contain the late Queen's private thoughts and observations rather than official documents or valuable objects. The targeting of personal rather than official materials supported Camilla's claim that she was seeking information about herself specifically. but it also demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how Queen Isabella organized her private papers, suggesting research and planning that went far beyond spontaneous curiosity. "Have all the stolen items been recovered?" Sir Margaret inquired. Edward nodded grimly. "Everything has been returned. But the violation remains, and the knowledge contained in those documents cannot be undone." After Charles departed, the council resumed their deliberations with a new understanding of the scope of Camilla's actions. The systematic nature of her theft, combined with her past history of manipulation and extortion, painted a picture of someone whose public persona masked a capacity for calculated deception. "We need to consider the Duchess herself," Archbishop William said quietly. "She's lived with these secrets for years, maintaining a perfect public image while knowing that discovery could destroy everything. The psychological toll must have been enormous." Edward had observed signs of that strain in retrospect. Camilla's occasional moments of distance, her perfectionism that sometimes bordered on obsession, her reluctance to engage in truly intimate conversations even within their marriage. He had attributed these traits to natural reserve or the pressure of public life, never imagining they might stem from carefully guarded secrets. "The question remains," Lord Chancellor Harrison said, "whether rehabilitation is possible or advisable. Can someone who has demonstrated such capacity for deception be trusted with the responsibilities of Queen Consort?" The weight of that question settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Edward found himself thinking not just about Camilla's fitness for royal duty, but about his own ability to rebuild trust with someone who had deceived him so completely. As the morning wore on, the council explored various scenarios and their potential consequences. Each option carried risks and complications that could resonate through the monarchy for decades. The perfect solution, if one existed, remained frustratingly elusive. Finally, Lord Chancellor Harrison posed the question that had been implicit throughout their discussions. "Your Royal Highness, setting aside all political and institutional considerations, what does your heart tell you about your wife? Do you believe she can be trusted again?" Edward stared at the leather portfolio containing his mother's stolen words, evidence of betrayals both past and present. The answer to that question would determine not only his personal future, but the fate of the ancient institution he had sworn to serve and protect. Outside the conference room windows, London awakened to another day, its citizens unaware that their future queen's fate was being decided in the oak-paneled chamber where so much of their nation's history had been written. Whatever choice emerged from this room would become part of that history, another chapter in the endless story of duty, sacrifice, and the price of wearing the crown. Fifth story, the autumn gardens of Thornbury Palace had never seemed more beautiful or more melancholy as Edward walked the familiar gravel paths alone, the decision of the Privy Council weighing heavily on his conscience. 6 weeks had passed since that fateful dawn meeting, and the carefully orchestrated plan they had developed was now reaching its culmination. In 3 days, the palace would announce that Crown Prince Edward and Duchess Camilla were separating by mutual agreement, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting privacy during their transition to separate lives. The official story, crafted by the finest minds in royal communication, would emphasize dignity, respect, and amicable resolution. There would be no mention of stolen documents, past affairs, or attempted blackmail. Camilla would retain her title and receive a generous settlement along with a private estate where she could live comfortably away from public scrutiny. In return, she would sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements ensuring that the true reasons for their separation would never become public knowledge. Edward paused beside his mother's memorial garden, where white roses bloomed in carefully tended beds arranged around a simple marble bench. Queen Isabella had loved this spot during her lifetime, often escaping here for moments of quiet reflection away from the demands of state. Now it served as Edward's sanctuary for wrestling with the most difficult decision of his life. The sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. Camilla emerged from behind a hedge of towering yews, dressed in a simple navy coat that emphasized her pale complexion. She had grown thinner over the past weeks, the strain of their situation evident in the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the shadows beneath her eyes. Yet she maintained the practiced composure that had served her well throughout their marriage. "I thought I might find you here," she said quietly, maintaining a respectful distance between them. Their interactions had become painfully formal since the truth emerged, as if they were strangers navigating unfamiliar diplomatic protocol. "I needed time to think," Edward replied, gesturing toward the bench where they could sit without the intimacy their situation no longer supported. "Tomorrow's announcement will change everything for both of us." Camilla took her seat carefully, her hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl awaiting judgment. "I've been thinking too," she said, "about what I want to say to you before everything becomes official, before we can never speak privately again." The finality in her voice struck Edward unexpectedly. Despite everything that had happened, despite the betrayals and deceptions, some part of him had continued to hope for reconciliation. The reality that their separation would be permanent, that they would become distant figures in each other's lives, felt like another loss to add to the growing collection. "I need you to understand something," Camilla continued, her voice gaining strength. "Every terrible choice I made, every lie I told, every secret I kept was driven by the terror of losing everything I had worked to become. When I met you, when your mother approved our engagement, it felt like redemption, a chance to be worthy of something greater than my past mistakes." Edward studied her profile as she spoke, noting the way afternoon light caught the auburn highlights in her hair and cast gentle shadows across features he had once found so beautiful. The physical attraction between them had always been secondary to mutual respect and shared duty, but he realized now how much he would miss simply looking at her, being in her presence during quiet moments like this. "I understand the fear," he said carefully, "but understanding doesn't erase the damage done. Trust, once broken so completely, leaves scars that never fully heal." "I know." Tears began to slip down Camilla's cheeks, though her voice remained steady. "I know that what I did was unforgivable. Stealing from your mother's private chambers, violating her memory, lying to you for years about who I really was. There's no adequate apology for that level of betrayal." The gardens around them continued their autumn transformation, leaves drifting lazily to the ground in the gentle breeze. Edward found himself memorizing the scene, understanding that this conversation would likely be their last moment of genuine intimacy. Soon they would return to their roles as public figures managing a carefully choreographed separation. "What will you do?" he asked. "After the announcement? After you moved to Blackwood House?" Camilla's family estate in Yorkshire had been quietly prepared for her residence, its staff sworn to discretion, and its grounds secured against media intrusion. She would live comfortably there, but Edward knew the isolation would be a form of exile for someone who had thrived in the social whirlwind of royal life. "I'll try to find peace with who I really am," she replied. "Not the perfect duchess I pretended to be, not the desperate young woman I was during the affair with James, but someone in between, someone who can live with her mistakes without being destroyed by them." The honesty in her response surprised Edward. Throughout their marriage, Camilla had rarely revealed such vulnerability or self-reflection. Perhaps the crisis had stripped away pretense in ways that ordinary life never could have achieved. "I want you to know," Edward said, choosing his words carefully, "that despite everything, despite the lies and the theft, I believe your feelings for me were genuine. The woman I fell in love with, even if she was partly a performance, contained elements of truth that I'll always treasure." Camilla's composure finally cracked completely, sobs shaking her shoulders as years of suppressed guilt and grief poured out. Edward's instinct was to comfort her, to offer the physical reassurance that had been part of their marriage, but the distance between them now felt unbridgeable. "I did love you," she managed through her tears. "Not the passionate, desperate love I felt for James, but something deeper and more stable. The kind of love that grows from respect and shared purpose. Losing that, losing you, is the price I have to pay for my deceptions." They sat in silence for several minutes. Two people who had once shared a life together, now separated by revelations that could never be undone. Edward found himself thinking about alternate timelines, scenarios where Camilla had trusted him enough to reveal her past before their marriage, where honest conversation might have prevented years of careful deception. "Do you think we could have worked through it?" he asked eventually. "If you had told me the truth from the beginning?" Camilla considered the question seriously before responding. "I don't know. The affair, the blackmail attempt, the settlement money. It's not exactly the background most princes looked for in a wife. Your mother's investigation suggests she had serious doubts about my character, even knowing all the facts." "But she approved the marriage anyway," Edward pointed out. "Perhaps she believed in redemption, in the possibility that people can change and grow beyond their worst moments. Or perhaps she simply calculated that the risk was manageable as long as the truth never became public." Camilla's voice carried a bitter edge. "Your mother was many things, Edward, but sentimental wasn't one of them." The comment stung because Edward suspected it contained more truth than he wanted to acknowledge. Queen Isabella had been a master of pragmatic decision-making, capable of accepting personal costs in service of larger goals. Her approval of his marriage to Camilla might have been strategic rather than personal, a calculation that the benefits outweighed the risks as long as proper management was maintained. "The irony," Edward said, "is that your efforts to hide the truth from me actually made everything worse. The theft, the years of deception, the systematic violation of my mother's privacy. Those crimes were worse than the original sins you were trying to conceal." "I know that now," Camilla replied. "But when you're living with that level of fear, when you wake up every day terrified that this will be the day your carefully constructed life collapses, rational thinking becomes impossible. Every decision is driven by panic rather than wisdom." As evening approached, they both understood that their private conversation was drawing to a close. Tomorrow would bring the final preparations for the announcement, meetings with staff and advisors, and the beginning of their choreographed separation. Their marriage, which had begun with such hope and public celebration, would end with careful management and diplomatic language. "I want you to be happy," Camilla said as they prepared to return to the palace. "After all this settles, after the immediate crisis passes, I want you to find someone who can love you without reservations or hidden agendas. Someone worthy of your trust." Edward nodded, though the prospect of future romance felt impossibly distant. The betrayal he had experienced would undoubtedly color his ability to trust again, to open his heart fully to another person. Camilla's deception had damaged not only their marriage, but his fundamental faith in his ability to truly know another person. "And I want you to find peace," he replied. "Whatever that looks like for you, wherever it leads you, I hope you can eventually forgive yourself for the choices that brought us to this point." 3 days later, the palace announcement dominated headlines around the world. The British public, who had embraced Camilla as their future queen, expressed shock and sadness at the news of the separation. Speculation about the reasons ran rampant, but the carefully crafted official statement provided no ammunition for scandalous theories. Edward watched the media coverage from his private study, the same room where he had first learned of Camilla's midnight intrusions into his mother's chambers. The stolen documents now rested in the royal vault, their secrets preserved but their power to destroy diminished by time and careful management. Charles Pemberton knocked and entered, carrying the evening security briefings that had become routine during the crisis. His professional demeanor had never wavered, even when dealing with a situation that involved his own family's complex history. "The Duchess's departure for Blackwood House is scheduled for tomorrow morning," he reported. "Security arrangements are in place, and the media has been given a firm boundary perimeter to respect." Edward nodded, understanding that this would be the final chapter of Camilla's time as a working member of the royal family. She would fade from public view gradually, becoming a footnote in the long history of royal marriages that had ended in separation or divorce. "Any regrets, sir?" Charles asked quietly, stepping briefly outside his professional role to acknowledge the personal cost of the situation. Edward considered the question carefully. Regrets seemed too simple a word for the complex mixture of loss, relief, sadness, and determination that filled his chest. He regretted the deception, the betrayal, the years of false intimacy. but he didn't regret the decision to prioritize truth and trust over the comfortable fiction their marriage had become. "I regret that it came to this," he said finally, "but I don't regret choosing honesty over convenience." The crown requires sacrifices, but it shouldn't require us to build our lives on foundations of lies. As night fell over Thornbury Palace, Edward stood at his window looking out over the gardens where he and Camilla had shared their final honest conversation. Tomorrow, she would begin a new life in exile, and he would begin the long process of rebuilding his understanding of duty, trust, and the price of wearing the crown. The locked room had been breached, its secrets exposed to the light. Now, like the palace gardens preparing for winter, everyone involved would have to find ways to grow again in soil forever changed by the storms they had weathered together.